Hey, yo. Welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I'm your host, Trevor Project, licensed marriage and family therapist. Today, I'm going to talk about something I'm doing professionally, because that's fun. The Taos Institute is a group of social constructionist thinkers, practitioners, educators, therapists. I've had a bunch of them on my podcast already. The Taos Institute is sort of the central hub. Used to be associated with Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and had a degree program. Now does sort of like working with like postgraduate type folks. For those of us who are already professionals, who are already in our career, it serves as like a hub for like-minded professionals to collaborate, to co-create, to do a lot of stuff that's really cool and meaningful with other people who take a social constructionist lens on things. I, as a therapist, was sort of introduced to the concept in grad school as we were studying postmodern therapies, which generally are sort of, I'm going to say, bracketed as narrative therapy, solution-focused therapy, and collaborative language therapy. Of those three, collaborative language is probably the lesser known, least known. And outside of the Taos Institute, which like is cheating, right? Because that's where these practitioners are. I've never run into somebody who identifies as collaborative language or even knows what collaborative language therapy is outside of the Taos Institute and my one supervisor in my training program who introduced me to the concept, which was lovely. Harleen Anderson's book, Conversations, Language, and Possibility, I regularly cite as a thing that kept me from quitting grad school and really feeling like therapy wasn't what I thought it was going to be. So that's a lovely book, especially for young therapists, especially for people who are interested in the helping professions. That is my approach to therapy, very much so. While I joke, some of the other Taoist people who have been on, one of them is Bruno Lenzi. You can check out that episode earlier. The episode I had with Bruno, the way I talk about therapy with Bruno is like my social constructionist, postmodern, collaborative language therapy. And then like it was like the week before, something like that, I recorded with Madeline Bush and we talked a lot about DBT. And so I do think those two episodes sort of highlight the two different schools of thought, of practice, of technique that I draw from the most as a therapist. This is a really long preamble to say the Taos Institute is hosting a symposium in New York City at Mercy University, which is awesome. To be able to meet in person. I have been a member of the Taos Institute for a while, a couple of years now, go to online workshops and different trainings, and also get to socialize with other like-minded professionals. Just like a Zoom call I get on once a month that's become really meaningful to me. And I get to meet some of those people in person, finally. Hooray! Yay for in-person meetings. So that's really cool. I've also never been to New York City. I'm 37 years old. I don't know why that's relevant. I've been to 38 out of 50 states, not been to Alaska or Hawaii, and then pretty much the 10 states in the Northeast I haven't been to. So not only have I never been to New York City, I've never really been to the Northeast region of the United States. Just for whatever reason, never got out there between sports and stuff. Just didn't happen. So I'm excited for that, which is awesome. And then in a couple months, I'll be in Boston. So crossing off my Northeast states. The symposium is in collaboration with Mercy University, as I mentioned. And, you know, a symposium, it's not a conference, right? A symposium is sort of this idea that we're going to get together as professionals, as thinkers, as people, and engage in dialogue and learn from each other. And that's one of the big things with social construction is learning, understanding, knowledge is relational. And so every conversation creates the opportunity to make a new learning and to create understanding in a way that didn't exist before. And like, I love that sentiment, you know, if the world would be a better place if all of us approached words that way. If all of us had a wonder to the possibilities that could happen anytime we get to interact with someone else. Um, so, you know, the internet's not that. I can tell you as somebody who has to read through YouTube comments. The internet is not that, unfortunately. So I'm really looking forward to the conference. I've been trying to think of a way to talk about the conference and what it'll be like. And I wrote a conversation starting paper for it. And again, I love the symposium idea. This isn't for continuing eds, although as a professional who needs to get continuing ed credits, that'd be great. This isn't a learning conference in that we're going to have a speaker who's talking at us and we all get to gush and go buy their book or follow them on social media. This symposium is really set up as conversation is going to happen between like-minded professionals, between sometimes not like-minded professionals, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the world and what's going on in our professions and how we learn and interact and create. Again, co-creating social worlds is the title, and that's an idea on how do we bridge gaps in connection and understanding. How do we use our language? How do we connect with other people? Not just with our physical words, but how do we communicate across borders, across divides in how people interact with the world? And that's certainly really needed now. But there's a lightness and a playfulness to the symposium that isn't just here's how people talk at you and tell you to be educated in the way that they're educated, but this is really about engaging in dialogue and learning together. And so the symposium called for sort of some conversation starters. There are some keynote speakers, which will be sort of that more conference vibe. And then there's conversation starters. And so members of the Taos community and some of the students from Mercer University and people from around the world got to submit conversation starting papers. And then at the symposium, we'll have breakout sessions to talk about these papers. And so I love that idea too, as somebody who presents at conferences regularly, who has talked around the country on different topics, religious trauma, neurodivergence, coaching and team dynamics. I've been in the field for 17 years. I've given a lot of talks on a lot of different topics, but I really like feedback. It's part of the reason that podcasting is a little unnatural to me. It's part of the reason that having a YouTube channel is not always my jam. I appreciate the space to have a creative outlet, and I appreciate the guests on the podcast. But like I like having guest episodes more than doing stuff myself because I like conversation. I like interacting with people. I love doing therapy, not as a prescriber who tells people how to fix things, but as somebody who joins with my clients in the room and gets to be a part of their journey for a little bit of their lives. That's this really cool thing. So I like the interaction. I even when I'm doing song reviews or talking about a piece of media, I'm responding to this other entity that feels more conversational than just like, let me offer you a lecture. So I am going to read you my paper, really long preamble short, which is not conversational, but the paper is written in a way that is designed to elicit response and is designed as, again, a conversation starter. So I thought that might be interesting to read. And then look at me working ahead. I'll be at the conference the week that this episode comes out, and then I'll be able to record an episode after the conference to sort of have hopefully thoughts. I'm just planning on that for content for the week. Hopefully some thoughts and some good things that I can engage with and share with you all as part of what we were able to co-create, what we were able to dialogue about, what we were able to engage in relational understanding. So, dun, 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 dun. The title of my conversation starter is Questioning the Utility of Religion as a Moral Arbiter. Religion is often treated as a kind of moral shortcut. In public life, policy debates, and even everyday conversations, religion is assumed to offer ethical clarity, something stable, trustworthy, and above dispute. Appeals to tradition, transcendence, or divine mandate frequently insulate religious institutions from the kinds of moral scrutiny applied elsewhere. And yet, when we look closely at history and contemporary practice, a different picture emerges. Organized religion has repeatedly functioned less as a guide to ethical living and more as a mechanism for legitimizing power. This paper is not an attempt to arrive at a final verdict on religion. Instead, it is offered as an invitation to question why religion continues to be positioned as a moral arbiter despite overwhelming evidence of ethical contradiction. I'm interested in what happens when moral authority is assumed rather than negotiated, and in how that assumption produces harm that is later individualized and pathologized. My central claim is simple. Many forms of religious harm are better understood as systemic moral injury rather than personal failure. I come to this question as a therapist who works with religious trauma, and the stakes of this conversation are visible in the therapy room. I regularly sit with people who were taught to understand their spiritual distress as a failure of faith, belief, or resilience. Their questions were framed as weakness, their ethical discomfort as temptation or sin. What becomes clear again and again is that the injury did not emerge because something went wrong inside the individual. The injury emerged because the moral system itself could not tolerate lived human experience. From a social constructionist perspective, this should not be surprising. Morality is not a fixed truth handed down by authority. It is something created, sustained, and revised in relationship. Meaning emerges through dialogue, context, and shared negotiation. When institutions insist on static moral certainty, they foreclose that process. Ethical dialogue is replaced with compliance, and conflict between doctrine and lived experience becomes not a site of curiosity, but a site of punishment. Through historical and contemporary examples, this paper explores how that dynamic produces moral injury and why decoupling morality from institutional religious authority is an ethical necessity. This conversation extends well beyond therapy or religious trauma work. Any social constructionist inquiry concerned with how meaning, legitimacy, and power are produced in relationship must grapple with religion as dominant meaning-making institution. Religious moral claims shape law, economic behavior, cultural identity norms, and social belonging. They often function as taken for granted truths rather than socially negotiated positions. From this standpoint, religion becomes a particularly revealing case study in how authoritative narratives stabilize themselves, marginalize alternative meanings, and resist relational accountability. Moral injury offers a useful lens here, typically defined as the psychological, relational, and spiritual harm that arises when individuals perpetrate, witness, or are subjected to actions that violate their deeply held moral values. Moral injury is often discussed in military or clinical contexts. But the concept applies just as powerfully to religious systems that require adherence to internalize ethical contradictions. When institutions claim moral authority while engaging in harm, individuals are left with impossible choices: suppress their moral intuitions or experience themselves as defective. Religious institutions tend to resolve this tension by individualizing the injury. Doubt becomes weakness, dissent becomes sin. Harm is reframed as a test of faith or a failure of obedience. In this way, systemic ethical failures are displaced onto individual bodies and psyches. The institution remains morally intact while the individual absorbs the damage. This is not an accidental byproduct of religion. It is a structural feature that allows moral authority to remain unquestioned. The papal bulls, Dum Diveras and Romanus Pontifex, offer a stark historical example of religion functioning as moral infrastructure for domination. Issued by Pope Nicholas V, these decrees authorized Christian explorers to invade, conquer, enslave, and extract resources from non-Christian lands. Importantly, these actions were not framed as tragic necessities. They were presented as morally righteous endeavors carried out in service of divine order. Romanus Pontifex did more than permit violence. It redefined exploitation as moral good. Indigenous peoples were rendered morally invisible while simultaneously subjected to moralized violence. Ethical consideration was reserved for those within the religious in-group, while harm inflicted on others was sanctified through doctrine. From the perspective of moral injury, this represents a profound ethical rupture. The harm was not a deviation from religious values, it was an expression of them as institutionally constructed. The effects of this moral framing did not end with formal colonization. They continue through land dispossession, cultural erasure, and systems such as religious residential schools with minimal gestures towards accountability from either church or state. Religion in this context functioned not as a moral compass, but as a moral laundering mechanism for empire. These dynamics are not confined to colonization practices. The Vatican's 2024 declaration, Dignitas Infinita, offers a contemporary illustration of how ethical contradiction is embedded within organized religion. The document proclaims the inherent and infinite dignity of every human being, a claim that initially appears universally affirming. Yet, this assertion is immediately constrained by doctrinal positions that deny bodily autonomy to women and delegitimize trans and gender diverse identities. What emerges is a form of conditional dignity. Humanity is affirmed abstractly while denied relationally. Individuals who lived experiences fall outside doctrinal boundaries are told that their dignity exists only insofar as they suppress or reject their embodied realities. This produces moral injury by forcing people into false choices between self recognition and moral belonging. A moral framework that requires self erasure in order to access dignity cannot meaningfully be called ethical. Religious moral contradiction also appears in far more mundane and easily overlooked forms. The Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, Mormonism, for y'all paying attention at home, provides a salient example. While presenting itself as moral authority grounded in family values, humility, and stewardship, the institution has accumulated enormous wealth and land holdings, making the church the second largest landowner in the United States. It operates simultaneously as a religious authority and a powerful corporate entity, shaping housing markets, zoning decisions, and regional economies. This accumulation of land is rarely framed as an ethical issue within religious discourse. Instead, it is justified through theological language of stewardship or divine provision. The material consequences of housing scarcity, wealth consolidation, and political influence are rendered morally invisible by the institution's presumed ethical legitimacy. Here, morality is displaced by intent. Because the institution claims to be moral, its actions are insulated from moral scrutiny. Where moral scrutiny does exist is in publicized scandals, where relational meaning, again, is pushed to the side. The Catholic Church has spent over $5 billion in defense of and settlements of abuse cases in the past 2 decades, while simultaneously spending millions to lobby against victim protection laws. The LDS, Latter-day Saints, Mormon Church, touted donating over $1 billion to charity in 2024, while being untaxed and worth nearly $300 billion. They have spent roughly $1 billion in defense and settlement of abuse cases, with an additional significant figure still pending a California court case. With a new cult documentary each week, scrutiny of religious institution gains cultural awareness, while the organizations circle their wagons and continue to hold places of privilege. When lived experience is subordinated doctrine, moral dialogue collapses into compliance. Questioning the moral framework itself becomes transgressive, making ethical repair nearly impossible. From a constructionist lens, religious trauma emerges not as failed belief, but as expected relational rupture. This rupture can be understood as harm produced when moral systems refuse to evolve in response to human realities, exacerbated by the intentional protection of authority over people. Reframing religious trauma as systemic moral injury has important implications beyond religion itself. It challenges therapeutic models that pathologize doubt, ethical discomfort, or departure from belief systems. It also challenges professional ethics that valorize neutrality in the face of harm. If morality is relational, ethical practice requires responsiveness to power, context, and lived experience. Silence or neutrality in the presence of systemic moral injury is not ethical restraint, it is complicity. Rather than offering replacement moral authority, this paper invites a different orientation altogether. Morality, from a relational standpoint, must remain open, dialogical, and accountable to those it affects. Decentering religious institutions as moral arbiters does not produce moral chaos. It creates the possibility for ethics grounded in relationship rather than hierarchy. If my communication here is clear, my aim is not persuading readers to agree with a single conclusion. My hope is to open space for conversation about how moral authority is constructed, whom it serves, and what kinds of harm become possible when morality is removed from relational accountability. Finn. That didn't make great content for the YouTube channel. Works great for podcasting. I've never felt so much like an ebook narrator than this episode, because I sometimes write an outline, which is like 3 random thoughts on a sheet of paper. So yeah, I mean, again, it's a different type of paper than something I would write to be published in a journal, or what I would have done in any of my schooling, which would have required citations and a bunch of other stuff. I do drop some facts and figures in there without trying to make it a scientific paper. It is true that the Mormon Church is the second largest landholder in the United States. And there's a lot of things that, like, Jeremy, the person who works in religious trauma, Jeremy the person is also Jeremy the therapist, but there's some things that I would have probably written differently if I was, depending on the audience, right? And so highlighting like moral contradictions, the Mormon Church requires, in order to be a member in good standing, a 10% tithe of what you make. And so members of the Mormon Church are required Like the Mormon church has access to people's bank account so that they can withdraw that tithe because it's non-negotiable. And yet they're worth 300 billion and gave $1 billion to charity. That's not a 10% tithe, is it? Right? Like, so even just the double standard of like what accountability is expected for the institution versus the person, I think broadens the scope of the point I was trying to make. But I was trying to not be super. I was intentionally trying to not be super anti-religion, because again, in the same, I think organized religion is harmful. Because organized religion is inherently hierarchical and based on in-group, out-group dynamics. I think there's a lot of woo-woo spirituality that is, I won't say just as harmful, because I struggle to think of institutions that have done more harm than organized religion. But people who say they're not religious but they're spiritual, I see harm there too, right? I work with religious trauma, so I see cult survivors. I see people who've been harmed, abused, and taken advantage of in various ways from the wellness community, from the disorganized wellness, spiritual but not religious sort of spaces, right? Like not having a institutional body like the Catholic Church or the LDS or Scientology or whatever it is, doesn't insulate you from perpetuating harm. I'm not suggesting the organization is the problem. I'm suggesting the organization is what prohibits it from being helpful. Morality is defined by ancient scriptures, has to, by definition, be dogmatic. And one of the things that I like about the symposium, one of the things that I like working with the Taos Institute in general, is that relationality is really centered. And so when we look at what cultures did before writing things down, oral histories were really common across different cultures. And our fascination, infatuation, me too, I like evidence-based practice. Our experience that writing things down and keeping record of things improves accuracy, but also limits contextualization. Facts and data outside of context don't mean a lot. One of my favorite pieces of media that comes out every year that's kind of niche, Matt Berry, not of What We Do in the Shadows, but the fantasy football analyst Matt Berry. Although Matt Berry of What We Do in the Shadows fame would be very funny doing fantasy football analysis. He writes a piece on statistics, and it's 100 facts to know before the season starts, and he basically writes 50 facts and he writes them in two different ways. So his 100 facts are 50 couples of facts about the same player. One of them makes the player sound really desirable and somebody should draft, and one of them makes the player sound really bad and like someone you should avoid. And the reason he writes this every year is just highlight that you can make statistics, you can tell a story with statistics that don't capture the entire reality. And so statistics, facts, and data, accuracy, the written record of what happened, might be accurate, but also not particularly valid in whatever you're trying to do, right? When we look at good research, it's both accurate and reliable. It is something that the metaphor that you learn in research methods, sort of Psych 101 level stuff here, is if it's a dartboard, it is, all three darts you throw are hitting near to the same spot. It is accurate. And it's valid. You're hitting what you're trying to hit, right? And so if you're aiming for the bullseye, you have three darts in the bullseye. That's good data. If you have three darts that are clustered really close together, but you dropped them by your feet, well, like that's not good, right? And so you can manipulate, and people do manipulate facts and data to tell a story. And we're storytelling creatures. And so while oral histories and passed down verbal traditions may be affected by lived experience and context, that's also what most written scriptures were, right? Like they're still affected by the context. They're not sort of like more accurate because of that. Again, like scriptures as fairy tales, not not being overtly offensive here, just this like fanciful stories that contain a moral truth. But like that's not all that scripture is, right? And that's why when it becomes dogmatic, because it's written down and therefore we have to go off what is written, it becomes dogmatic and more harmful. Whereas oral histories can be updated and adjusted, that may diminish their accuracy and make them more valid and reliable to current lived experience. And so you can update a culture, a community's ethics based on current lived experience. And like I think that ethic that is relational doesn't it ideally is a both and. It doesn't need to be authoritative and dogmatic that takes any relation away, and it doesn't need to be 100% relational without any sort of like empirical backing. Empirical as in like numbers, not empire. So, yeah, I I want I want to say I don't think people will disagree with what I wrote or the way I wrote it. But in my work as a religious trauma therapist, I'm certainly aware that sometimes it's easy for me to see the patterns and the harm in religion because I work with people who are harmed by religion, and it's not like I forget that religion has good parts. I don't interact with that as much. And I see the good parts of organized religion as being available without the harmful pieces, right? So if religion does a really nice job of providing community for people, but like we could have community if we had other third spaces that were in the same financial position as churches, which is like untaxed property, untaxed donations, like given a leg up on providing community for people without money being a factor would make a world of difference. And then I think you don't need the dogma of an organized religion to provide that community. And so community in the church is there because of the church's privileged status, not because the church provides community that couldn't be provided elsewhere. So again, I mean, it's not that I forget that there are people who experience the church positively and well. It's just that I sort of am at a position in my career where I can say yes, and that could exist without any of the religious stuff. So other than like a fear of dying and having some sort of afterlife story that we get to tell our brains is relieving, I get that. I'm not somebody who ascribes to that, obviously, in the way I couched that phrase. But so yeah, I'm super stoked. There's a bunch of really interesting sounding conversation starters. I am one of many conversation starters in the group, which is a really cool, really diverse group of professionals from different professional backgrounds, from different lived experiences. There's one Awakening, it's called WASH, Awakening Community at the WASH Line, a Sufi perspective on collaborative dialogic practices, reimagining knowledge from a socially, culturally attuned perspective, leading through social construction, relational risk and radical care in fostering, practicing radical presence in a pressured world. Students' experiences impact their sense of belonging to university. A couple things about borders and framework. Listening beyond words, challenging the limits we create. So there's more. There's a bunch more. Look at me. I'm still scrolling to the bottom. So yeah, I mean, just a flavor. It's, I think, I don't know. By the time this goes out, it'll be 2 days before the Symposium starts. But I think it's full. I don't know. I don't want to limit their sales, but I'm not doing this as a marketing thing. I'm sort of doing this as a, hey, y'all, I have a fairly consistent listener base. So come along with me while I do some of the things that I do professionally, as opposed to just straight up content creation all the time. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to meet some people who I know virtually, in person. Call me old fashioned. But I like that. I like to do therapy in person versus telehealth. I offer telehealth because I also live in the world that I have kids and a car that doesn't always work and whatever else comes up. And so I understand it's a necessary practicality, but like I like to do therapy in person. I prefer the dynamics and the interaction to get live in person versus on a screen. So a lot of these people who have known for a couple of years, I'll get to, not a lot, several of them, I'll get to interact with. Sheila McNamee has been on the podcast in an early episode, like within my first 30 episodes. So it's a pretty good get. I had some surprisingly famous in their worlds people early on in the podcast, which remains a mystery to me. But Sheila McNamee, she had COVID when I recorded with her. I don't think that is in the recording. A little peek behind the screen here. But yes, I did get to interview her back in the day, and she's like one of my professional heroes. Between her and Harleen and Ken Gergen and some of the other big names in the social constructionist and collaborative language spaces. Ken Gergen will be there, pretty sure. So some people I know online, some people who professionally have had an impact on me, and some people I don't know. I as the therapist, it's always surprising, and I'm hyperbolic, so I say things like I don't like people because I'm an introvert, and that's true. And like meeting new people gives me, because I'm an introvert and I'm autistic, but also I'm ADHD, I'm very contrarian. I like to meet new people, and there's a lot of dopamine. And I know some very cool people in the area, New York City. And again, I've just never been out there, so I get to meet some of those people in person outside of the Taos community who I just know from either like religious trauma spaces or whatever. So excited to go out there. I have experienced New York City through Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation. So I feel like I have navigated New York via web slinging before, but it will be my first experience with the East Coast subway system, which is cool. Plan to do Central Park for sure. Planning to do the Empire State Building for sure. Not sure what else I'm going to do out there. Get some pizza, I guess, is the other big thing that I'm definitely planning to do. I'm not like a Times Square person. Like that sounds lame and oddly overstimulating. So not that. When I go visit places, I like to I don't mind like the touristy hit the hot spots, but I do like to sort of like go where the locals go, per se, as it were, to like experience that. I try, my brain likes to get in the headset of like, what if I lived here? So yeah, pretty excited for all of that stuff. Not excited to fly. I'm 6'3" and airplanes were not designed with my size in mind. But I did, because it's a work thing, pay for nonstop flights, which is nice. So yeah, some cool stuff coming up. I'm excited for the conference. I'm optimistic that I will have some good learnings to share with y'all after the conference. I'm sure, even though I sort of made fun of workshop conferences as like a way for people to sell their books, I'm sure I will have new cool connections. People, I'm like expecting I'll have a bunch of guests lined up for the podcast, not scheduled, because I'm not going to pull out my phone when I'm talking to a person and be like, hey, when can you be on my podcast? Because I hate that, which is why I said it in a silly voice. But a bunch of the Taos people are already on my radar. I have like a guest sheet stored somewhere of like people to get on the podcast. It's 70 people long. I just don't like scheduling things. But I do have guests lined up, which will also be exciting after the conference. So hooray for, I was gonna say for humanity, but I don't really feel that. Hooray for cool people doing cool work. Yay. That's what I got for you this week. And next week, come back for part 2. If you want to. And then, like, subscribe, leave reviews. I don't know. I'm having a weird viral moment on the interwebs. So perhaps if you also do those review type things, more people will find my work, which is cool. I'm not internet famous by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not going to go to New York and have people recognize me. But it is always one of those weird algorithmic things that I really detest about the modern internet, that are quirky and weird, and sometimes something will pop off and it's silly in a way, but is also part of why I do The podcast is to meet new people and network, but part of it is to put out like good information in a world that is filled with Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate's. That's not on that level of reach, but I see 15 people a week physically in my office and get hundreds of downloads on stuff like YouTube, and the podcast is pretty consistent in that range as well. So, more people tune in and can engage with me here than I can engage with in my office. And so that's good too. So anyway, long plug. Rate, like, subscribe, tell a friend. And if you're on the East Coast, I won't see you in New York because too short a notice. But if you're on the East Coast, a very dear collaborator of mine, Emily Lopley, she's been on the podcast 3 different times, and I are hosting a retreat in outside of Boston, in the Boston metro area, in the woods by the ocean. It's a lovely location. It's called Rest and Return, a weekend for soft landings. Emily is a social worker who's been in the profession for nearly 2 decades, more than 2 decades. I don't know how old she is. I'm bad at that game. Has a ton of experience, is also a trauma sensitive yoga instructor, in that she leads trauma sensitive yoga and also teaches other instructors. So she is a wealth of knowledge, somebody who practices a lot of trauma-informed work and somatic stuff, very aligned with me in how we both like to practice, coming from a lens of relational trauma, of intergenerational trauma, and that helping isn't just talk therapy, but is also our environment, our physical space that we occupy, and our physical bodies. And so if that is of interest to you, that is in Boston in May. That'll be in the show notes. If you want more information about that, you can check that out in the show notes. If you want more information about Emily, also have a plug there in the show notes. Really long preamble. Postamble? What's the word for epilogue? But it's not really an epilogue. Outro. I don't know. Anyway, I'm babbling. Let's get out of here. Y'all, thanks for tuning in. Come back next week and the week after. I appreciate all of you. Take care of yourself. Take care of somebody else. Peace.